The telegram crumpled in Florence Harper's gloved hand as the stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of a ramshackle general store. And her first thought was that surely this could not be Greeley, Colorado, the prosperous cattle town her intended husband had described in his carefully worded letters. Dust swirled around the hem of her traveling dress as she stepped down from the coach, squinting against the harsh June sunlight of 1882. The driver tossed her trunk down with little ceremony, tipping his hat before climbing back onto his perch. Florence stood alone on the rutted dirt street, clutching her reticule and trying not to let disappointment overwhelm her completely. For 6 months, she had corresponded with Jacob Miller, a rancher who had painted vivid pictures of his thriving cattle operation, his spacious ranch house, and the comfortable life awaiting his future bride. The letters had arrived in Philadelphia regularly, written in a strong hand that spoke of confidence and success. Florence, 22 years old and facing the prospect of becoming a permanent burden on her married sister's household, had seen those letters as salvation. Now, looking at the dusty street lined with weathered buildings, she wondered if salvation had been too much to hope for. "Miss Harper." A deep voice spoke behind her, tentative and rough. Florence turned and found herself looking up at a tall man in his mid-20s, his dark hair badly in need of cutting, his clothes clean but patched in several places. His face was handsome beneath the stubble, with strong features and eyes the color of coffee. Those eyes held a mixture of hope and apprehension that immediately put Florence on guard. "I am Florence Harper," she confirmed, keeping her voice steady. "And you are Jacob Miller, miss." He removed his worn hat, twisting it between his hands. "I am mighty glad you made it safe." The journey from Philadelphia must have been long. Florence studied him carefully, noting the threadbare state of his shirt collar, the scuffed boots that had been repaired more than once. This was not the prosperous rancher she had expected. This was a man who looked like he counted every penny. "Your letters," she began carefully, spoke of a successful cattle operation. Jacob's face flushed, and he had the decency to look ashamed. "Miss Harper, I can explain. Maybe we could talk somewhere more private. I have a wagon just over there." The wagon, when Florence saw it, was as worn as everything else about Jacob Miller. The wood was weathered gray, one wheel looked newer than the others, and the 2 horses pulling it were serviceable but far from the fine stock she had imagined. Jacob helped her up onto the bench seat with gentle hands, then loaded her trunk into the back with an ease that spoke of physical strength. He climbed up beside her and clicked his tongue at the horses, guiding them down the main street and out toward the open prairie. They rode in silence for several minutes, Florence too angry and disappointed to speak, Jacob clearly gathering his courage. The landscape around them was beautiful in its own way, endless grass rippling under the wind like a golden ocean, mountains visible in the distance beneath a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. "I did not exactly lie in my letters," Jacob finally said, his voice low. "But I did not tell you the whole truth either, and for that I am sorry." "The whole truth being," Florence kept her gaze fixed ahead, "I do own a ranch, 320 acres. I have cattle, about 40 head right now. The house is standing and the roof does not leak. But I am not prosperous, Miss Harper. I am barely holding on." He paused and she heard him swallow hard. 2 years ago my father died, left me the ranch and also his debts. The bank has been patient, but they want their money. I have been working myself near to death trying to make the ranch profitable, but it has been a hard go. So you decided to acquire a wife under false pretenses. Florence's voice was sharp with betrayal. "I decided I needed help," Jacob said quietly. "And I was lonely enough to convince myself that stretching the truth was not the same as lying outright. I am sorry, Miss Harper, truly sorry. If you want to turn around and go back to Philadelphia, I will understand. I will pay for your ticket." "With what money?" The words came out more bitter than Florence intended. Jacob flinched but did not argue. "You are right to be angry. I brought you all this way based on expectations I cannot meet. It was wrong." Florence sat in silence, her mind racing. She had spent nearly all her savings on clothes appropriate for a rancher's wife, on the journey west, on hope. Going back to Philadelphia meant returning to her sister's home with nothing, admitting failure, living as a charity case for the rest of her days. At least here, she might have some form of independence, even if it was not the comfortable life she had imagined. "I notice you did not offer to marry me anyway," she said finally. Jacob looked at her, surprise clear on his weathered face. "I did not think you would want to, not after knowing the truth. What I want and what I can afford are two different things, Mr. Miller." Florence kept her voice practical, though her heart was pounding. "I spent most of what I had coming here. I have no family beyond a sister who made it clear I was no longer welcome to stay indefinitely. So it seems we are both in difficult positions. Miss Harper, I would not want you to marry me out of desperation. And yet you advertised for a mail-order bride, which is exactly what you were looking for, a woman desperate enough to marry a stranger." Florence turned to look at him directly. "Let us be honest with each other from this point forward. You need help with your ranch and you are lonely. I need a home and a purpose. Perhaps we can come to an arrangement that benefits us both." Jacob guided the horses around a deep rut in the road, his expression thoughtful. "What kind of arrangement? Marry me as planned, but give me time. Time to know you, time to decide if this life is something I can bear. And in return, I will help however I can with the ranch. I am stronger than I look, Mr. Miller. I grew up in Philadelphia, but my father was a tradesman, not a gentleman. I know how to work." "I could not ask you to do ranch work, Miss Harper. That would not be proper." "Proper?" Florence almost laughed. "I have just agreed to marry a man I met 10 minutes ago, a man who misrepresented himself in his letters. I think we are well beyond proper." The corner of Jacob's mouth twitched in what might have been the start of a smile. "You have a point." They traveled for another half-hour before Jacob turned the wagon down a narrow track that led through rolling grassland. In the distance, Florence could see a house, barn, and several outbuildings. As they drew closer, she assessed her new home with a practical eye. The house was small, maybe 4 rooms, built of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney. The roof looked sound, as Jacob had promised, and someone had planted flowers along the front, though they were struggling in the prairie heat. The barn was larger than the house, its doors hanging slightly askew. A corral held several horses, and beyond that she could see cattle grazing on the hillside. It was not what she had expected, but it was not hopeless either. Jacob helped her down from the wagon, his hands careful and respectful. "I know it is not much. It is honest," Florence said. "That is more than I can say for your letters, but it is a start." She picked up her skirts and walked toward the house, aware of Jacob following behind with her trunk. The door was unlocked, opening into a single room that served as kitchen, dining area, and parlor. A stone fireplace dominated one wall with a cast-iron stove beside it. The furniture was simple but well made, a table with 4 chairs, 2 rocking chairs, shelves holding dishes and dry goods. 2 doors led off the main room. Jacob carried her trunk to one of them, setting it down carefully. "This was my mother's room. She died when I was 15. I have been sleeping in my father's old room, but you should have this one. It has more light." Florence stepped into the small bedroom. A brass bed took up most of the space, covered with a faded quilt. A washstand stood in the corner and a small wardrobe leaned slightly to one side. A window looked out toward the mountains, and Jacob was right. The light was good. "Thank you," she said quietly. They stood there awkwardly for a moment, two strangers trying to figure out how to navigate the situation they found themselves in. Finally, Jacob cleared his throat. "I need to see to the horses and check on the cattle. There is food in the larder if you are hungry. Not fancy, but filling. I will be back before dark." After he left, Florence sat down on the edge of the bed and let herself feel the full weight of her circumstances. She was hundreds of miles from everything familiar, about to marry a man she did not know, facing a life of hardship she had not anticipated. She could cry or she could adapt. Florence Harper had never been much for tears. She changed out of her traveling dress into something more practical, then explored the house thoroughly. The larder held basics: flour, cornmeal, salt pork, beans, dried fruit, coffee. The dishes were mismatched but clean. Everything spoke of a man living alone, doing his best but missing the touches that made a house a home. She found a bucket and walked outside to the pump, filling it with cold, clear water. The vegetable garden beside the house was choked with weeds, but she could see the remnants of what had once been careful rows. Tomato plants struggled for survival among the grasses, and a few beans climbed crooked poles. By the time Jacob returned, dusty and tired, Florence had made coffee, fried salt pork, and baked cornbread in the temperamental stove. It was simple food, but the smell of it filled the small house with warmth. Jacob stopped in the doorway, staring. "You did not have to do this." "We both need to eat," Florence said practically. "Wash up and sit down before it gets cold." They ate in silence at first, both too hungry and too uncertain for conversation. Finally, Jacob pushed his empty plate back and met her eyes. "Miss Harper, I meant what I said earlier. I do not want you to feel trapped here. If you want to return to Philadelphia, I will find the money somehow." "And if I stay, what exactly are you proposing?" "A marriage in name only, a business arrangement," Jacob's face colored. "I am proposing that we get married proper, by the preacher in town. But I will not rush you into sharing a bed. That is something that should happen between two people who want it, not two people fulfilling an obligation." Florence studied him across the table. His honesty now, after the deception of his letters, was striking. She could see the exhaustion in the lines around his eyes, the work-roughened hands that held his coffee cup carefully as if afraid to break it. This was a man pushed to his limits, trying desperately to hold on to something his father had left him. "Why is the ranch so important to you?" she asked. Jacob was quiet for a long moment. "My father built this place from nothing, came out here in '68, right after the war. He survived Indian attacks, droughts, blizzards, everything the land could throw at him. When he died, he made me promise I would keep it going. I aim to honor that promise, even if it breaks you, even then." Florence stood and began clearing the dishes. "Then we had better make sure it does not break you. Tomorrow you can show me what needs doing. Tonight you can tell me about your cattle operation, what debts are outstanding, and what your plan is for making this ranch profitable." Jacob blinked. "You want to know about the business, Mr. Miller? If I am going to be your wife, I need to understand what we are facing. I may not know cattle, but I can add and subtract, and I can learn." For the first time since they met, Jacob smiled fully, and Florence felt something flutter in her chest. His whole face changed when he smiled, the worry lines smoothing away to reveal a younger, more hopeful man beneath. They talked long into the evening, Jacob explaining his situation in detail. He owed the bank $800, a crushing sum. His cattle were good stock, but he did not have enough of them to make a real profit. The ranch could support more animals, but he needed capital to buy them. He had been selling off cattle to pay the interest on his loan, which meant his herd kept shrinking instead of growing. "It is a vicious circle," Florence said. You need money to make money, but you are spending what you make just to stay afloat. That about sums it up. When is your next payment due? End of September. $300. Florence did the math in her head. 3 months to earn $300 from a herd of 40 cattle. It seemed impossible, but she had learned that impossible just meant difficult. The next morning, she woke before dawn to the sound of Jacob moving around in the main room. She dressed quickly and came out to find him building up the fire in the stove. "You are up early," he said. "So are you. What needs doing first?" Jacob looked at her fancy Philadelphia dress and shook his head. "Miss Harper, you are not dressed for ranch work." "Then I will change. But stop calling me Miss Harper. If we are going to be married, you should call me Florence." "Florence," he repeated, and she liked the way her name sounded in his rough voice. "I am Jacob, or Jake. Most folks call me Jake." "I will call you Jacob," she decided. Jake sounds too casual for a business partner. That almost smile appeared again. "Is that what we are, among other things?" Florence changed into her oldest dress and an apron, then followed Jacob out into the early morning light. The air was cool and fresh, the sun just beginning to paint the mountains pink. He led her to the barn, showing her where he kept the milk cow, the chickens, the various tools and equipment needed to run a ranch. "The cow needs milking twice a day," he explained. "Chickens need feeding, eggs collected. That would be a big help if you do not mind." "I can manage a cow and chickens." She could not, actually, having never milked anything in her life, but she watched Jacob demonstrate, then tried it herself. The cow, a patient beast named Bessie, tolerated Florence's clumsy attempts until finally milk began to flow in steady streams into the bucket. "You are a natural," Jacob said, and she could hear the approval in his voice. Over the next few days, they fell into a routine. Jacob rose before dawn to check the cattle, fix fences, and handle the 100 tasks that kept a ranch running. Florence managed the house, the garden, the chickens and cow. She learned to bake bread in the temperamental stove, to cook beans that did not turn to mush, to make coffee strong enough to satisfy a working man. They talked during meals, sharing bits of their histories. Jacob spoke of growing up on the ranch, of his mother who had loved books and taught him to read, of his father who had been tough but fair. Florence told him about Philadelphia, her father who had died when she was 18, her mother who had followed him 2 years later, her sister who had grudgingly taken her in but made it clear Florence needed to find her own way. "She was not cruel," Florence said, "just practical. They had 3 children of their own and not much money. I was a burden and we both knew it." "You are not a burden here," Jacob said quietly. "You have been a help already." On Sunday, they rode into Greeley for church. The small town was busier than it had been when Florence arrived, with families in their best clothes gathering at the white-painted church on the corner. Florence wore her good dress and bonnet, aware of the curious stares as Jacob helped her down from the wagon. The preacher, Reverend Thomas, was a kind-faced man in his 50s who welcomed them warmly. "Jake Miller, good to see you, and this must be your intended bride." "Florence Harper," Jacob said. "We would like to arrange a wedding, Reverend." "Wonderful, wonderful. Come by the rectory after services and we will discuss the details." The church service was simple and heartfelt, the hymns sung with more enthusiasm than skill. Florence found herself relaxing slightly, the familiar rhythms of prayer and scripture comforting despite the strange surroundings. She was aware of Jacob beside her, his voice surprisingly good when he sang, deep and true. After services, they met with Reverend Thomas in the small rectory beside the church. The preacher asked the standard questions about their intentions and circumstances, and if he suspected this was more of a business arrangement than a love match, he kept his thoughts to himself. "I can perform the ceremony next Saturday if that suits you both," he said. "Do you have witnesses?" "I can ask Tom Wilkins," Jacob said. "He has the ranch next to mine, and his wife Mary can stand up for Florence if that is all right." "That would be fine," Florence agreed, though she felt a pang at marrying without any family present. They drove back to the ranch in comfortable silence, the summer sun hot overhead. Florence found herself studying Jacob's profile as he drove, noting the strong line of his jaw, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he looked at her. He was handsome, she admitted to herself, and kind, despite his deception about his circumstances. She had certainly seen worse matches in Philadelphia. The week before the wedding passed quickly. Florence worked in the garden, coaxing the struggling plants back to health. She cleaned the house from top to bottom, washing curtains that had hung dirty for months, scrubbing floors until they gleamed. Jacob noticed and thanked her, but she saw something else in his eyes too. Guilt, perhaps, that she was working so hard for so little return. On Friday evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set, Florence decided to address it directly. "You have been very quiet the last few days," she said. "Are you having second thoughts about the wedding?" Jacob turned to look at her, surprise clear on his face. "No, are you?" "I am having thoughts," Florence admitted, "but not second ones. I am wondering what our marriage will actually look like. You said you would not rush me, but you also have not touched me beyond helping me in and out of the wagon. I do not know what you expect." Jacob's face colored in the fading light. "I do not rightly know either, if I am being honest. I have never been married before. I figured we would just work it out as we went along." "That seems like a recipe for misunderstanding. You are probably right." Jacob hesitated, then said carefully, "Florence, I find you attractive. I would be lying if I said otherwise. But I know you did not come here expecting to marry a poor man, and I do not want you to feel obligated to be a wife in all ways just because of circumstances." Florence felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. "That is considerate of you, but I think we should at least try to be married properly. Not tonight, but soon. Otherwise, what is the point? The point is you have a home and I have help with the ranch." "That is a business arrangement, not a marriage." Jacob met her eyes steadily. "Is that what you want? A real marriage?" "I want a chance at a real marriage," Florence corrected. "I want to see if we can build something together. But that requires both of us trying, not just me cooking your meals while you sleep in the other room." "All right," Jacob said slowly. "We will try. But Florence, if you change your mind, if this is not what you want, you tell me. Promise me that." "I promise." They married the next day in the small church, with Tom and Mary Wilkins as witnesses. Tom was a weathered man in his 40s who slapped Jacob on the back and told him he was a lucky man. Mary was plump and cheerful, gathering Florence into a hug that smelled of lavender and fresh bread. "If you need anything, you just come over," Mary said warmly. "Us ranch wives have to stick together." The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful. Florence listened to Jacob's voice, steady and sure, as he promised to love and honor her. When it was her turn, she made the same promises, and meant them as much as she could mean promises to a man she barely knew. Jacob kissed her when the Reverend pronounced them married. A brief, chaste press of lips that nonetheless made Florence's heart race. His eyes, when he pulled back, were warm, and she saw hope there, fragile but real. They had dinner at the Wilkins Ranch afterward, a celebration that felt more genuine than Florence expected. Mary had prepared a feast of roasted chicken, fresh vegetables from her garden, and a cake that was slightly lopsided but delicious. Other neighbors appeared as the afternoon wore on, bringing gifts and good wishes. Florence met Sarah Bennett, a widow who ran her own small ranch with the help of her teenage sons. She met the Carsons, a young couple with a baby. She met old Pete Hoffman, who had come west in the gold rush of '59 and stayed when he found he preferred ranching to mining. They were good people, Florence realized. Hard-working, honest, willing to help a neighbor. This community could be home if she let it. As the sun began to set, Jacob caught her eye and nodded toward the wagon. They made their goodbyes, accepting teasing comments about newly married couples with as much grace as possible, then started the drive back to their own ranch. The evening air was cool and sweet, carrying the scent of grass and wildflowers. Florence leaned against Jacob's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, and let herself imagine this could work. At the house, Jacob helped her down from the wagon with gentle hands, then stood there looking uncertain in the growing darkness. "I will see to the horses," he said finally. "I will wait up for you," Florence replied and saw his eyes widen slightly. Inside, she changed into her nightgown and wrapper, brushed out her hair, and tried to calm her racing heart. She had never been with a man before. Her mother had given her the basics of what to expect before she died, and her sister had added a few more details before Florence left Philadelphia. But knowing in theory and experiencing in practice were very different things. When Jacob came in, he stopped short at the sight of her sitting by the fire, her hair loose around her shoulders. "Florence, we are married now," she said simply. "Unless you have changed your mind." "No." He moved closer, then knelt beside her chair, taking her hand. "But I do not want to hurt you or scare you. We can wait." "I do not want to wait," Florence said, surprising herself with her certainty. "I want to start our marriage properly." Jacob stood, drawing her up with him, and for the first time since they met, he kissed her like he meant it. His lips were warm and firm against hers, his hands careful on her waist. Florence felt heat bloom through her body, a wanting she had not expected. He led her to his room, which was now their room, and what happened there in the darkness was tender and awkward and painful and sweet all at once. Jacob was patient, murmuring apologies when she gasped at the sharp pain, kissing away the tears that leaked from the corners of her eyes. Afterward, he held her close, his hand stroking her hair. "Are you all right?" "Yes," Florence said and realized she meant it. "Are you?" She felt his chest shake with quiet laughter. "Better than all right. Florence, I know this started as an arrangement of convenience, but I want you to know I am going to try to be a good husband to you. And I will try to be a good wife." They fell asleep tangled together, and when Florence woke in the early morning light, she felt changed in ways that had nothing to do with the physical act of consummation. She felt claimed and claiming, part of something larger than herself. Summer moved into July, hot and dry. Florence worked alongside Jacob, learning the rhythms of ranch life. She learned to ride, though not well, bouncing awkwardly in the saddle until Jacob showed her how to move with the horse instead of against it. She learned to spot a sick cow, to check fences for breaks, to read the weather in the shape of clouds on the horizon. At night, they came together in the big brass bed, learning each other's bodies with increasing confidence. Jacob was a generous lover, patient and attentive, and Florence found herself looking forward to the nights as much as the days. But despite their best efforts, the ranch was still struggling. In mid-July, 3 of their cattle went missing, either stolen or wandered off. Jacob spent 2 days searching before he found them in a ravine, one with a broken leg that had to be put down. The loss of even one animal was significant. "We cannot afford this," Jacob said that night, his head in his hands. "If we lose any more cattle before September, we will not make the payment." Florence did some calculations on paper. "What if we sold eggs and milk in town? Mary told me there is always demand." "That is women's work," Jacob protested. "I will not have you peddling goods like a common trader." "I am a rancher's wife," Florence said firmly, "and ranchers' wives do what needs doing. Besides, it would give me a chance to meet more people in town." Jacob looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, we can try it." Every Wednesday and Saturday, Florence drove the wagon into Greeley with baskets of eggs and jars of milk and butter she churned herself. She set up outside the general store, and to her delight, her goods sold quickly. Women stopped to chat, sharing gossip and recipes. Men tipped their hats and bought eggs for their wives. She met Margaret Sullivan, who ran the boarding house and bought eggs by the dozen. She met Dr. Henry Chen, a Chinese physician who had come to Greeley during the railroad construction and stayed to serve the small but growing community. She met Emma Davis, a schoolteacher who was new to town and grateful for a friendly face. The money Florence earned was not much, but it helped. She kept careful records in a notebook, tracking every penny. By the end of July, she had earned $37, which she presented to Jacob with pride. He stared at the money, then at her. "Florence, this is incredible. It is a start. We need more, but it is a start." In August, Tom Wilkins came by with a proposition. He was taking a herd of cattle to Denver and needed help. The job paid well, but it would mean Jacob being gone for 2 weeks. Jacob was torn, needing the money but reluctant to leave Florence alone. "I will be fine," she insisted. "I can manage the ranch for 2 weeks." "It is not proper for you to be alone." "Jacob, we are past proper. Take the job. We need the money." Mary Wilkins promised to check on Florence daily, and with that assurance, Jacob agreed. The morning he left, he held Florence close, kissing her with a desperation that surprised them both. "I will be back as soon as I can," he promised. "I know. Be safe." Alone for the first time since her wedding, Florence discovered she liked the solitude. She rose early to milk Bessie and feed the chickens, spent the morning working in the garden, the afternoon checking on the cattle that grazed within sight of the house. In the evenings, she sat on the porch and watched the sun set over the mountains, and felt a peace she had not known in years. Mary came by as promised, bringing fresh bread and news. "You are holding up well," she observed. "Some women cannot stand the isolation of ranch life." "I find I do not mind it," Florence said. "In Philadelphia I was never alone. There was always noise, people, commotion. This is different, but not bad." On the 10th day of Jacob's absence, Florence woke to find 2 of the horses missing from the corral. Her heart sank as she realized someone had stolen them during the night. She immediately rode to the Wilkins ranch to report the theft. Tom organized a search party, but the thieves had a head start. After 2 days of searching, they found 1 horse, but the other was gone. The loss was another blow to their finances. When Jacob returned from Denver, tired and dusty, Florence had to tell him what happened. She watched his face go gray with worry. "This is not your fault," he said, but she could see the defeat in his eyes. "How much did you earn in Denver?" she asked. $140. Florence did her own math. With what she had earned from eggs and milk, they had enough for the September payment, but barely. And they had lost a horse and a cow since spring, reducing their resources even further. "We need to do something different," she said that night as they lay in bed. "We cannot keep scrambling like this, always one disaster away from losing everything." "I am open to suggestions." Florence had been thinking about this for days. "What if we specialized? Instead of just raising cattle, what if we bred horses?" Tom said good horses bring premium prices, and we have the grazing land. Breeding horses takes time and knowledge. So we learn. Old Pete used to breed horses before he switched to cattle. I heard him talking about it at our wedding celebration. What if we asked him to teach us? Jacob was quiet for a long moment. "It could work, but we would need to buy breeding stock, and we do not have the capital." We have 40 cattle. What if we sold half of them, used that money to buy quality breeding horses and focused our energy there? We could keep a small herd of cattle for milk and meat, but make horses our primary business. That is a big risk, Florence. So is what we are doing now. At least this risk has potential upside. They talked long into the night, weighing the options. Finally, Jacob agreed it was worth trying. The next day, they rode over to Pete Hoffman's small ranch to ask his advice. Pete was a leathery man in his 60s, his face deeply lined from years in the sun. He listened to their proposal, then nodded slowly. "Horse breeding is good business if you know what you are doing," he said. "And I could teach you, but you need to understand it will be at least 2 years before you see any real profit. Horses take time." "We have time," Florence said. "What we do not have is a sustainable path forward with what we are doing now." Pete studied her with shrewd eyes. "You are a smart woman, Mrs. Miller. All right, I will help you, but you have to promise to listen and learn. Too many young folks think they know better than their elders." "We will listen," Jacob promised. Over the next few weeks, they worked with Pete to develop a plan. They would sell 20 of their cattle, keeping 20 for their own use. The money from the sale would buy 3 quality mares and 1 good stallion. They would need to improve the corral and build better shelters for the horses. Pete knew a rancher in Wyoming who had excellent breeding stock and was willing to give them a fair price. The risk was enormous. If the horse breeding did not work out, they would have fewer cattle to fall back on. But Florence felt certain this was the right choice. She could not explain why, only that continuing on their current path led nowhere but slow failure. In early September, they made the sale. 20 cattle brought them $600, more than Florence had dared hope. They paid the bank their $300, then took the rest and made the journey to Wyoming with Pete to buy their breeding stock. The horses were beautiful, strong and well-formed with good temperaments. The stallion, a magnificent bay named Thunder, cost them $200 alone. The 3 mares, all young and healthy, cost another $150. That left them with $50, which they used to buy lumber and supplies for improving their facilities. As they drove the horses back to Colorado, Florence felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration. They had just bet everything on an uncertain future. But as she watched the horses move, their coats shining in the sun, she felt hope too. The work of setting up a breeding operation consumed the fall. Jacob built better corrals with Pete's help, while Florence studied everything she could find about horse breeding and care. She corresponded with a veterinarian in Denver, asking questions and learning. She read books borrowed from Reverend Thomas, who had a surprisingly extensive library. Their first breeding happened in October, Thunder to a mare named Daisy. If all went well, they would have a foal in 11 months. Florence marked it carefully in her notebook, beginning the records that would track their new venture. Winter came early and hard that year. Snow fell in November, heavy and relentless. Jacob worked from dawn to dusk, keeping the animals fed and sheltered. Florence kept the house warm and prepared hot meals, helped with the feeding when the snow was not too deep. At night, they huddled together in their bed, exhausted but together. It was during a particularly fierce blizzard in December that Florence realized she was pregnant. She had missed her monthly courses twice now, and in the mornings she felt queasy. The realization filled her with both joy and fear. A baby would make everything more complicated, but it would also make their family real in a way it was not yet. She told Jacob on Christmas Eve, as they sat by the fire in their small parlor. She had managed to make a passable dinner despite the limited ingredients, and Jacob had surprised her with a gift, a shawl he had bought in Denver with his earnings from the cattle drive. "Jacob, I have news," she said, her heart pounding. He looked up from the socks he was darning. "Good news or bad? I think good. I am going to have a baby." Jacob dropped the socks, his mouth falling open. "A baby? Are you certain as I can be without seeing a doctor? I have all the signs." He crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. "Florence, this is wonderful, terrifying but wonderful. You are not worried about the timing. When is the baby due? Late June or early July, I think." Jacob pulled back to look at her, his eyes shining. "We will make it work. We always do." That night, lying in bed with Jacob's hand resting protectively on her still flat stomach, Florence reflected on how much had changed since she stepped off that stagecoach in June. She had arrived expecting wealth and comfort, found struggle and uncertainty. But she had also found Jacob, with his steady strength and gentle hands. She had found a community that welcomed her. She had found purpose and hope. She had found home. The winter passed slowly, each day a battle against the cold and snow. Florence felt the baby growing inside her, a flutter that became a kick, a presence that became real. Jacob treated her like she was made of glass, constantly worrying, until she had to remind him that women had been having babies since the dawn of time. In March, Thunder bred the 2nd and 3rd mares, both taking successfully according to Pete's examination. By April, Daisy was visibly pregnant, her belly swelling with the foal she carried. The sight filled Florence with wonder and identification. They were both carrying new life, both hoping for healthy arrivals. Spring brought a crisis of a different sort. The bank sent a letter informing them that the loan terms were changing. The new owners wanted their money faster, which meant the next payment, due at the end of June, would be $400 instead of $300. Jacob read the letter 3 times, his face pale. "We do not have $400. Even if we sell every egg and every drop of milk from now until June, we will not have $400. Florence's mind raced, calculating possibilities. "We could sell some of the remaining cattle. If we do that, we will not have enough left to sustain us, and the horses are not ready to sell yet. Then we need to find another way to earn money." Over the next few weeks, they tried everything. Jacob took odd jobs in town, repairing fences and buildings. Florence increased her egg production, somehow coaxing the chickens to lay more. She began taking in laundry from the boarding house, washing and pressing clothes despite her growing belly. She baked bread and pies to sell alongside her eggs. Mary Wilkins and the other ranch wives rallied around them, buying more than they needed, spreading word in town about Florence's goods. Emma Davis, the school teacher, organized a fundraiser at the school, a social where people paid admission to help the young couple. The community's generosity moved Florence to tears. These were not wealthy people. They were all working hard to make their own way. But they understood that in this harsh land, neighbors helped neighbors because any of them could be in the same position tomorrow. By the 3rd week of June, they had $360. Still 40 short. Daisy went into labor on a warm night, and Jacob and Florence stayed with her in the barn, ready to help if needed. The foal came in the early hours of morning, a perfect colt with Thunder's bay coloring and strong legs. Pete, who had come to supervise, pronounced it one of the finest foals he had ever seen. "That colt will be worth good money when he is grown," Pete said. "You chose your breeding stock well." An idea sparked in Florence's mind. "Pete, would you be willing to buy the colt now, not at full price but as an investment? You could take him when he is weaned, raise him, and sell him later for profit." Pete scratched his chin thoughtfully. "How much do you need?" $40. "I will give you 50 for him. That is fair value for a nursing colt, and I think he will be worth 10 times that in 3 years. Relief flooded through Florence so strongly she had to sit down. "Thank you, Pete. You have no idea what this means." "I have some idea," Pete said gently. "I have been where you are, young and struggling. Someone helped me once. I figure I am just passing it along." On June 28th, Florence drove into Greeley with Jacob beside her and made the payment at the bank. The banker, a thin man with spectacles, counted the money twice and made a notation in his ledger. "That brings your balance to $345, he said. "Next payment is due end of September." In the wagon afterward, Florence felt the baby kick hard as if celebrating. She put her hand on her belly and smiled. "We made it," Jacob said, sounding stunned. "I did not think we would, but we made it." "We did it together," Florence corrected, "with help from good people." 2 weeks later, on a hot July afternoon, Florence's labor began. Mary Wilkins came to help, along with Sarah Bennett, who had birthed 5 children of her own. Jacob was banished from the bedroom but stayed close, pacing in the main room. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next morning. Florence had never experienced such pain, such exhaustion. But finally, as the sun climbed high, she heard the first cry of her child. "It is a boy," Mary announced, wrapping the baby in clean cloths. "A healthy, strong boy." They named him William Jacob Miller, and he had his father's dark hair and his mother's determined chin. Jacob held his son with trembling hands, tears streaming down his weathered face. "He is perfect," Jacob whispered. "Florence, he is perfect." "We made something good," Florence said, exhausted but happy. "Out of all the struggle and uncertainty, we made something good." The next months were a blur of sleepless nights and constant feedings, but Florence had never been happier. William was a good baby, healthy and strong. Jacob was a devoted father, getting up with her for night feedings, rocking his son while singing old songs his own mother had sung to him. The ranch slowly began to thrive. By September, they made their payment on time with money left over. The 2 other mares foaled in October, both producing strong, healthy offspring. Jacob and Florence decided to keep these foals, building their breeding stock rather than selling it off. As fall turned to winter, Florence realized she was pregnant again. This time, the news was met with pure joy. William was 9 months old, a chubby baby who was just starting to crawl. Another child would make their house full, but it would also make it rich with family. The second baby, a girl they named Margaret Ann after Jacob's mother, arrived the following June. She was smaller than William had been but no less healthy, with wisps of red gold hair that came from some ancestor neither of them could name. The years passed, each one a little easier than the last. Their horse breeding operation gained a reputation for quality. They sold their first trained horse when the original colt was 3 years old, receiving $600 for an animal Pete had paid $50 for. The profit was split with Pete as they had agreed, but even half was more money than they had seen in one sum since starting the operation. By the time William was 4 and Margaret 2, they owned 8 breeding horses and had sold 5 others for good profit. The bank loan was paid off completely. Jacob built an addition onto the house, giving the children their own room and Florence a proper kitchen with a real cooking stove. They had 2 more children in the following years, another boy named Thomas and a daughter they called Rose. The house that had seemed so small and bare when Florence first arrived was now full of noise and laughter and life. On a warm evening in the summer of 1891, 9 years after Florence had stepped off that stagecoach, she sat on the porch with Jacob, watching their children play in the yard. William was helping Thomas catch fireflies in a jar. Margaret was showing Rose how to make a chain of clover blossoms. "Do you ever regret it?" Jacob asked quietly. Coming here, staying with me, Florence took his work roughened hand in hers. Not for a single moment. I came here expecting wealth and found struggle instead. But I also found you and our children and a life richer than any bank account could make it. I am sorry I lied in those letters. I am not, Florence said, surprising them both. If you had told the truth, I might not have come, and then where would we be? You would be struggling alone, and I would be a burden on my sister. Instead, we are here together with a family and a home and a future. Jacob pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. You are the bravest person I know, Florence Miller. You took a risk on a stranger and built a life from nothing. We built a life from nothing, she corrected. It was never just me or just you. It was always us. The children's laughter rang across the prairie as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. In the corral, the horses whinnied softly. From the barn, they could hear the milk cow lowing, ready for evening milking. The sounds of home, of life, of family. Florence leaned against her husband's shoulder and felt complete contentment. She had come west looking for security and found something far more valuable. She had found love, real and true, and tested by hardship. She had found purpose in building something with her own hands. She had found home not in a place but in the man beside her and the children playing in the yard. The wild prairie stretched out before them, endless and beautiful, full of promise and possibility. And Florence Harper Miller, who had arrived 9 years ago expecting wealth, knew now that she had found something far more precious. She had found her heart's home. Years continued to pass with the gentle rhythm of ranch life. William grew tall and strong, showing a natural talent with horses that made his father proud. By the time he was 12, he could train a horse as well as any adult, working alongside Jacob with patience and skill. Margaret developed her mother's head for business, keeping careful records of their breeding lines and sales in notebooks that grew more detailed each year. Thomas, always the adventurous one, loved exploring the prairie and often returned with stories of wildlife he had seen or interesting rocks he had found. Rose, the baby of the family, had inherited her father's gentle nature and could often be found in the barn, talking softly to the horses and braiding their manes. The Miller Ranch became known throughout Colorado for producing excellent horses. Buyers came from as far away as Denver and Cheyenne, willing to pay premium prices for animals that bore the Miller brand. What had started as a desperate gamble had become a thriving enterprise. Pete Hoffman remained a close friend and advisor, often joining them for Sunday dinners that were loud and chaotic with 4 growing children. He never married, but he told Florence once that the Miller family felt like his own, and he was grateful for it. The Wilkins remained their closest neighbors and dearest friends. Tom and Jacob often worked together, helping each other with the larger tasks that required extra hands. Mary and Florence traded recipes and child-rearing advice, supporting each other through illnesses, injuries, and the ordinary challenges of raising families on the frontier. Emma Davis married a local rancher named Samuel Foster, and their children became playmates for the Miller children. The community that had welcomed Florence as a stranger became family in the truest sense, bound together by mutual support and genuine affection. In 1895, when William was 13 and Rose was 7, Greeley finally got its own school building with 2 classrooms and 2 teachers. Florence insisted all 4 children attend regularly, valuing education even when it meant less help on the ranch. Jacob agreed, though he grumbled about it sometimes when there was extra work to be done. Margaret particularly excelled in school, showing such aptitude for mathematics and literature that her teacher suggested she might continue her education beyond the 8th grade level most frontier children achieved. Florence and Jacob encouraged her ambitions, setting aside money each month toward her future schooling. As the children grew older and more capable, Florence found time to pursue her own interests. She started a small library in town, organizing donations of books and creating a system for residents to borrow them. She helped establish a women's society that raised money for community improvements like a proper doctor's office and a town well. Jacob served on the town council for several years, lending his voice to decisions about Greeley's growth and development. The wild frontier town Florence had first encountered was becoming a proper community, with paved streets, gas lamps, and even talk of telephone lines. But despite the modernization, the essential character of the place remained the same. It was still a land where hard work mattered more than fancy pedigrees, where neighbors helped neighbors, where the vast sky and endless prairie reminded people daily of their small place in the grand scheme of things. On their 15th wedding anniversary in 1897, Jacob surprised Florence with a trip to Denver. They left the children in Mary Wilkins' capable care and took the train, something Florence had not done since her original journey west. Denver had grown tremendously, with electric lights and motor cars and all manner of modern wonders. They stayed in a fine hotel, dined in elegant restaurants, and attended a performance at the Opera House. Florence wore a dress Jacob had bought her, deep blue silk that made her feel like a lady again. But as wonderful as it was, she found herself eager to return home by the 3rd day. "I thought you would love the city," Jacob said as they rode the train back to Greeley. "Being from Philadelphia and all, I did love it," Florence assured him, "for a visit. But it is not home anymore. Home is our ranch, our children, our life together. I would not trade that for all the opera houses in the world." Jacob smiled and took her hand. "I am a lucky man, Florence Miller." "We are both lucky," she corrected, a phrase that had become familiar between them over the years. William turned 18 in 1901, a young man now rather than a boy. He had his father's height and build, but his mother's determination and business sense. He had been courting Sarah Bennett's daughter Ruth for over a year, and no one was surprised when he asked permission to marry her. The wedding was held at the ranch in June, with the whole community in attendance. Florence watched her oldest son marry the girl he loved and felt the bittersweet pang of time passing. It seemed impossible that 18 years had passed since she had held him as a newborn, yet here he was, starting his own family. Jacob built William and Ruth a small house on the edge of their property, keeping his son close to help with the ranch. It was always understood that William would take over the operation eventually, continuing what his grandfather had started and his parents had built. Margaret left for school in Denver that same year, enrolled in a program for young women at a private academy. She wrote home weekly, her letters full of excitement about her studies and city life. Florence missed her terribly, but was proud of her daughter's ambitions. Thomas, at 15, announced he wanted to be a veterinarian. He had always been fascinated by animals, and Dr. Chen, who still practiced in Greeley, had encouraged his interest. Jacob and Florence agreed to support his education when the time came, though it would mean sending another child away. Rose, at 13, was their homebody. She declared she never wanted to leave the ranch, that she would stay and help her parents forever. Florence smiled at her daughter's certainty, knowing that forever often looked different when you were older. The new century brought changes to Greeley and the surrounding country. Automobiles appeared on the streets, though horses were still far more common. The railroad expanded, bringing more settlers and more commerce. Talk of women's suffrage became common, and Florence found herself passionately involved in the movement. She gave speeches at town meetings, organized petition drives, and corresponded with suffragists in Denver and beyond. Jacob supported her fully, often noting that his wife had as much right to vote as any man, having worked as hard as anyone to build their community. When Colorado women finally gained full voting rights, Florence was among the first to register. On Election Day, she cast her ballot with pride, Mary and Sarah at her side doing the same. It felt like acknowledgement of something she had always known. Women were not just helpmates but full partners in building the West. As Florence approached her 40th birthday in 1902, she found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. 20 years since she had stepped off that stagecoach, terrified and angry and determined. 20 years of hard work, heartbreak, joy, and love. The house that had seemed so bare and hopeless now rang with life. Even with William married and Margaret away at school, Rose and Thomas filled it with noise and energy. And soon there would be grandchildren, as Ruth was expecting their first baby in the spring. Florence's body bore the marks of her life, her hands roughened by work, her face lined by sun and wind. But she was healthy and strong, capable of a full day's labor even as she approached middle age. The girl who had known nothing of ranch work could now ride, rope, doctor sick animals, and manage the books that tracked their thriving business. Jacob, at 44, had gray threading through his dark hair and permanent squint lines around his eyes from years of staring at distant horizons. But he was still strong, still capable, still the kind and steady man she had married. Their love had deepened over the years, growing from uncertain beginnings into something as solid and enduring as the mountains. They had survived droughts and blizzards, cattle thieves and difficult births, lean years and years of plenty. They had built not just a ranch but a legacy, something that would outlast them both. The first grandchild, a boy named Jacob William Miller, arrived in March of 1902. Florence held her grandson for the first time and felt the circle complete. This child carried her husband's name and her own blood, a link to the future she had helped create. More grandchildren followed in the coming years, as William and Ruth had 3 more children, and Margaret returned from Denver to marry a young lawyer and settle in Greeley. Thomas went east for veterinary school, and Rose surprised everyone by falling in love with a neighboring rancher's son and marrying at 19. The ranch continued to prosper, though Jacob gradually turned more of the daily operations over to William. He still rode out each morning to check on things, but the hard physical labor was increasingly handled by his son. Florence, too, stepped back from the most strenuous work, focusing instead on managing the business side and helping with the growing number of grandchildren. In 1910, on their 28th wedding anniversary, Jacob and Florence rode out to a favorite spot on their property, a small rise that offered views of the mountains and the prairie. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sun set in a glory of red and gold. "Do you remember that first day?" Jacob asked. "When you stepped off the stagecoach and looked at me like I had stolen your last hope," Florence laughed. "I was so angry. I felt so betrayed. You had every right to be, maybe. But if you had been the wealthy rancher you claimed to be, I wonder if we would have built this." She gestured at the land spread before them. "If it had been easy, would it have been as meaningful? Probably not," Jacob admitted. "The struggle made us partners in a way prosperity never could have." Florence leaned against her husband's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him that had been her anchor for nearly 3 decades. "I came here expecting to be a wealthy man's wife, living a comfortable life. Instead, I became a working partner in building something from nothing." And that made all the difference. "I love you, Florence Miller," Jacob said quietly. "I have loved you since that first night when you insisted we talk business and make a real go of things. You are the strongest person I have ever known." "We are both strong," Florence said. "And we are stronger together than we ever could have been apart." As the sun disappeared below the horizon, they rode back to the ranch house, where lamplight glowed in the windows and the sounds of their family drifted on the evening air. William and Ruth had brought the children for supper, and Rose had come with her husband and their baby daughter. The table was crowded and loud, multiple conversations happening at once, children laughing and adults talking over each other. This was what Florence had built with her determination and Jacob's steady strength. A family, a legacy, a home that would endure. That night, lying in bed with Jacob's arms around her, Florence thought about the girl she had been at 22, desperate and frightened and trying so hard to be brave. She wished she could go back and tell that girl it would all work out, that the struggling cowboy would become the love of her life, that hardship would lead to happiness beyond imagining. But then again, maybe that was the nature of life. You could not know where the path would lead when you first stepped onto it. You could only keep walking, keep working, keep hoping. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very determined, you found that the path led somewhere better than you had ever dreamed. Florence had come west expecting wealth and found struggle. But in that struggle, she had found purpose, partnership, and profound love. She had found home, not in a place but in a person, in a family, in a life built together through determination and faith. The wild frontier that had seemed so hostile when she first arrived had become her beloved home. The struggling cowboy who had deceived her had become her trusted partner and deepest love. The impossible situation had become a beautiful life. As Florence drifted off to sleep, held safe in her husband's arms, she knew with absolute certainty that she would not change a single moment of the journey that had brought her here. Every hardship had been worth it. Every struggle had meaning. She had arrived expecting wealth, but had found something infinitely more valuable. She had found her heart's true home, and that was worth more than all the money in the world.